probably heard of a theory that the Minions were inspired by a group of workers who served as guinea pigs in a lab during World War II, but would you believe me if I told you the truth behind it might be even worse than that? And that instead of adult workers, it was actually children who were used in a cruel and bizarre experiment a long time ago. The story you're about to hear is based on a supposed bizarre discovery by an anonymous documentary filmmaker that took place in an isolated orphanage in the mountains of Eastern Europe, and was dubbed by them as the classified file of the Blackwood Orphanage, which is exactly why we're going to call this case the Blackwood Secret. Have you ever heard the expression, art imitates life? Well, that's exactly the case with the Minions, only in the worst possible way. Officially, the story begins last fall, when an anonymous investigator was sweeping through abandoned institutions in Eastern Europe. His target was the Blackwood Orphanage, an isolated place in the mountains that mysteriously closed its doors at the height of World War II in the 1940s. While the whole world had its eyes glued to the battlefields and trenches scattered across Europe, silent horrors were taking place far from the spotlight within those cold orphanage walls, completely camouflaged by the smoke of war. According to the filmmaker, while exploring the ruined basement of the building, he found a false bottom in the floor of the old infirmary. What was hidden there wasn't gold, it wasn't weapons, but rather a rusty metal box. And inside that box, there were 2 sets of documents that would forever change the way we look at the big screen. The first set was made up of logistical and scientific reports from the orphanage's director. Named only Dr. D, maybe for death, this mysterious man wasn't just a caregiver for children. He was an inventor with traces of a mad scientist, obsessed with creating what he called an unrestrictedly docile workforce. In this same document, the children didn't have their names revealed. They were just called Minnie. And after that word, they were followed by numbers. For example, the first child was called Minnie 1, the second, Minnie 2, and so on. But what really caught the investigator's attention was the second set of documents he found, also inside that same rusty metal box, something much more fragile and human. It was a small notebook with a worn leather cover. You could say it was a diary secretly shared by 3 kids who lived at the Blackwood Orphanage, handwritten and filled with red marks that looked like dirt, or who knows, old blood. Going by the contents of the diary, which was written by one of them, the 3 children had become inseparable in the middle of that god-forsaken place. Some pages were illegible because they were extremely worn by time and completely yellowed, making it clear that it had really been stashed down there for a very, very long time. Their names, signed in childish handwriting on the very first page, were Kevin, Bob, and Stuart. Yep, the exact same names as our protagonists from the first Minions movie. Experiments. It was cross-reading these 2 materials, the mad scientist's perspective and the 3 children's perspective, that revealed the disturbing truth behind what we watch in theaters today. In the scientist's files, the investigator discovered that the Blackwood Orphanage was, in fact, a massive and macabre front. The place served as a lab for a brutal experiment in psychological conditioning and long-term sensory deprivation. And, as you might have guessed, the director cataloged everything that happened under the alias Project Minnie. The director's goal was sick. He believed that by breaking the children's sense of individuality, he could mold perfectly obedient minds. Soldiers or workers who wouldn't question a thing, who would only serve their master. And if that reminds you of the plot of a certain animated movie, you can be sure that, if this account is true, it's no coincidence. To do this, he forced the orphans to wear what he called focus suits, and that was when the investigator found the photograph. It was attached by a rusty paperclip in the middle of Kevin, Bob, and Stuart's diary. The black and white picture showed a group of children lined up next to what looked like the hull of a submarine or a large industrial tank. The kids were wearing dark, heavy suits, extremely similar to old-school diving suits. The detail that made the investigators' blood run cold, however, was the cylindrical helmets. They didn't have human faces. The front part only had a single, large round visor right in the center. The only childish detail you can notice in the photo is the height of the kids, visibly shorter than the staff at the Blackwood Orphanage, and also the fact that some of them were holding toys like dolls, stuffed animals, or even balls. The silhouette in the photo was undeniably familiar. It was identical to the yellow characters we see in theaters today, but totally stripped of any color, humor, or joy. They were children trapped in walking metal cages. Pain and suffering. If you've ever played the Despicable Me games or watched the movies, you know that a big part of the minions' charm is how clumsy they are. They trip, bump into each other, fall downstairs, and we laugh. But the origin of this in the Blackwood Diary will leave a lump in your throat. Trust me. The diary narrated the nightmare of living inside those suits. Kevin, who was the oldest, wrote most of the pages trying to keep his friends' hopes alive. He reported how the helmets were incredibly stuffy and heavy for a child's neck. But the worst part was the visor. Stuart described, in shaky handwriting, making it clear he was younger than Kevin, how the single, thick glass lens completely destroyed their depth perception, since everything they saw was always gray. Because they only had a centralized field of vision through the helmet's visor, they couldn't even grasp the distance of things. The result? As described in the documents, these ones written by Dr. D, the kids were always bumping into walls, tripping over furniture, and falling over each other in the dark hallways of the orphanage, pretty much exactly like the minions do in the movies. This alone was extremely painful and left the children covered in bruises. And many, trapped in the suits, would cry so loud you could hear them from dozens of feet away. And it all directly contrasts with what we see in the minions, who, despite going through all sorts of situations, never get hurt, always make a ton of noise, and when they cry, it's impossible not to hear them. The language of despair. As time went by, and under the constant watch of the orphanage staff, the orphans even had a hard time just talking to each other. This was reported by Bob in the diary, making it clear he was the shortest of the three. Bob, in a childlike way, says that the only thing he heard when he was inside the suit was his own voice. Probably because the thick metal of the diving suits muffled the kids' voices. There was no way to whisper or talk normally. On top of that, he mentions that the orphanage staff watched them all the time, probably to observe the effects of the experiment, as made clear in Dr. D's reports, since the children weren't allowed to take their suits off, not even to sleep or go to the bathroom. Because of this, for the three of them to hear each other in the pitch-black dorms at night, they had to scream as loud as they could. Even so, the sound that escaped the suit's small oxygen valves was completely distorted and came out high-pitched and sped up due to the metal's acoustics. As time went on, the isolation and the sheer exhaustion of having to scream long sentences meant they simply stopped using normal language and developed a language of their own. The boys started communicating through short, scrambled sounds that only they understood. It was easier, took less breath, and echoed better in the helmets. A language born purely out of despair and lack of air. That sounds frighteningly identical to the Minionese language invented for the movies. Those fast, squeaky little voices we find so cute. In the mind of the orphanage director, it was the sound of children being crushed, little by little. After all, perfect workers don't need to speak, they just need to execute orders. The Master. In the Blackwood file, or rather, in the diary of the three little friends who lived like brothers, the final pages are, according to the investigator, the hardest to read. As tormenting and terrible as it was to read about all this suffering that these poor orphan children were subjected to, it explains the minions' behavior towards Gru, or villains like Scarlet Overkill. You probably remember that in the movies featuring the little yellow beings, the sole purpose of a minion's life is to find the most evil villain in the world to serve. If they don't have a boss, they get depressed and lose the will to live. In the final entries, Kevin's handwriting no longer shows any hope. He writes about an uncontrollable, almost robotic, and artificial urge to simply obey. He describes the need to follow Dr. D's orders, whom he now calls the master of the orphanage, no matter how absurd, cruel, or senseless they were. It was too late. Those poor children had reached such a massive level of suffering and stress that they had lost the ability to think for themselves. The brainwashing experiment had erased who they were before the suits. They became empty shells that only functioned if someone told them what to do. We could say that, if all this is true, the minions' unconditional submission to their masters is the mirror image of an irreversible psychological trauma. Seriously, the similarity between the blind devotion to the director of the Blackwood Orphanage and the devotion to the movie villains is terrifyingly identical. On the final sheet of yellowed paper that had anything written on it, we see one of the three friends, who said he couldn't even remember what his own name was anymore, stating that those would be his very last written words. Due to the extreme cold of that Eastern European winter, he had lost 2 of his fingers to necrosis, since not even medical care was allowed for the kids, as they couldn't take off the suits under any circumstances. So, gripping his pencil with his 3 remaining fingers, just like the minions, who only have 3 fingers, this child reports that even though he didn't remember his name, he remembered what Dr. D called him. And since that was how his master referred to him, that was how he was going to sign that final page. Mini 1. Which, if you think about it, sounds an awful lot like the name Minion, doesn't it? And you might not know this, but the word minion comes from archaic English and literally means servant, lackey, or subordinate. Just like the experiment intended, and just like the children became. The mystery. The big question hanging in the air, and which the anonymous investigator raises in his final report, is how did this macabre story make its way to the halls of Hollywood? Who was the suit that decided to take the pain and psychological trauma of the poor children Kevin, Bob, and Stuart and turn it all into a gigantic, lucrative joke full of adorable mascots? Maybe that person thought it was just an urban legend. Or maybe, just maybe, seeing the photograph of those children locked in diving suits didn't even faze the person who found it. The investigator swears that he keeps the photo and the original diaries in a secure safe, knowing that few people in the world would have the stomach to believe him. But he leaves a disturbing warning. Every time he turns on the TV and hears those high-pitched laughs and that incomprehensible language coming from a colorful screen, he can't even crack a smile. He only sees children in a forgotten orphanage in the cold mountains of the 1940s, trapped inside heavy metal diving suits, trying to find a way to talk through the steel. If you want more videos like this, comment down below, add more. We're leaving 2 really cool videos for you to stay with us here on the channel. Click and have fun. Thanks.